Yep, sure. So I am the head of stakeholder engagement at ENA. Joined just coming up to about 2 years ago now and have been in a number of different roles. So yes, very excited to be joining today and have led our work on community energy engagement and local authority engagement so far.
Excellent, thank you. Mark, over to you.
Great. So afternoon, everybody. My name's Mark Atherton. I'm Director of Environment for Greater Manchester Combined Authority. The Combined Authority brings together the 10 local authorities of Greater Manchester with an elected mayor, and I've been asked to speak to you for about 10 minutes on some of the work that we've been doing on local area energy planning. So I'll just share my screen.
Oh, hold on, we haven't started officially just yet, Mark.
Sorry.
We've still got people who are joining us.
Yeah, we'll then have Christos.
If you can, if you can just leave ENA to let people in, that'd be helpful. Just because I think
we'll let people in.
Yeah.
Good afternoon all, this is Christos Kalodas. I'm the capacity strategy lead with Electricity Northwest. I'm leading Electricity Northwest work on distribution of future energy scenarios that inform our planning. And I've also involved in our load related investment plan for the next price control and our reinforcement network planning.
We then have Helen Boyle.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Helen Boyle, Head of Regional Development for the North West and the West Midlands for Cadent, the UK's largest gas distribution network operator. And my role is to help with all things hydrogen across the regions that we operate within. So on the hydrogen production side, but also on the demand side as well, and what that means for our infrastructure.
Excellent, thank you. And then we go over to Hewell Lloyd.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Hugh Lloyd. I'm a research associate at UK 100. UK 100 is over 100 local and combined authorities that are leading the path to net zero. Many of them have ambitions to successfully achieve net zero before 2050. And clearly there's a learning cycle that goes with that. I've been doing some work for them over the last year or so on ED2 and some of the implications that come out of that for local planning, local engagement, and the interaction between the networks and places.
Excellent, thank you. And then
we've got a few people in the lobby, so I'm going to admit them all in a second so we can.
Yeah. So I was going to say, Emily, so if you can then just do a quick intro, open to the event, and then hand it straight over to Mark, and then you'll give your presentation before handing over to Barbara, and then we'll let people in, and then the event will run as briefed.
Sorry, so Mark's doing his presentation first.
Yeah, that's
yeah.
correct.
You can say hello to everyone and then just give straight over to Mark.
Did we get a chance for Duncan to say hello?
No, we didn't.
Those were just instructions for you all to each other.
So we need to let people in now.
Yeah, just because there were randomly people being let into the event early.
Okay, so you're happy for me just to do a quick hello, welcome, and hand over to Mark once everyone's in.
Perfect.
Great. Hi everyone, welcome to ENA's Next for Net Zero webinar on local energy plans. Thank you for joining us all this afternoon. So to kick things off, I will hand straight over to Mark Atherton.
Thanks, Emily. So my name's Mark Atherton. I'm Director of Environment for Greater Manchester Combined Authority. The Combined Authority brings together the 10 local authorities of Greater Manchester with an elected mayor. And I've been asked to speak to you for about 10 minutes on some work we're doing on local area energy planning. This work originated about 4 years ago when we did some work with Bays under the Smart Systems and Heat programme, where we took one of our districts, Bury, and looked at mapping out heat in particular across the whole of Bury. And we thought this approach has got merit. So we worked with our DNOs and Bays and an energy systems catapult to extend that to look at not just heat, but wider energy use and do that at the street to grid scale. So starting off, Greater Manchester has a target to be carbon neutral by 2038. It's quite a stretching target. It's represented by the area under the blue curve that you can see on this graph, and the sort of a pink fleshed colour shows where we're currently at. So there's currently a gap between where we need to be and where we want to be, and where we currently are.
Mark, I'm sure everyone can see your. Oh, there it is. There, I can see it. Sorry.
Okay.
Got it.
And so that gap's nearly 10 million tonnes, which roughly equates to 1 year's budget. So we've already spent next year's carbon budget. To try and move from where we are to where we need to be, we need to plan a much more intricate scale what that transition looks like. And that's really where local energy plans come in. So what we're trying to do here, the big picture, is set out the infrastructure changes that are going to be required to take us from where we are now to where we need to be carbon neutral by 2038. And we've adopted a 7-step process, which has been supported by Energy Systems Catapult, which starts off at identifying stakeholders, setting a vision, creating an understanding the local energy system, so input of a lot of data at that stage, investigate future scenarios, which I'm going to come on to in a moment, set out a local plan, and then lead and implement it, monitor and review, and then you repeat it. And our feeling is that we probably need to repeat this process every 5 years. So the way that system's changing at the moment, we think about a 5-year interval is necessary to make sure that the data that you're using is as up to date as possible. We didn't just do this piece of research in isolation, though. So we had a lot of supporting research over the last 2 or 3 years that has all gone into this model to give us the best opportunity of being as robust as possible in our data modelling. None of this is perfect, I've got to say. Some of it is using available data, and we know that there are some gaps, but we're using the best available data that we have. I won't go through all of this, but I will talk about some of the more important ones. So we did undertake a stock condition survey of 1.2 million homes across Greater Manchester, which gave us a really good understanding of what their current energy demand would be. We also are doing some work with BEIS looking at heat networks and what the impact of heat networks might be across the city region. And then finally, the electric vehicle infrastructure, we've done some work with TFGM to try and model what electric vehicle infrastructure might look like. Now, the reason I've mentioned those 3 in particular is because to get to carbon neutral by 2038, our 2 largest emissions are decarbonising heat and decarbonising transport, largely private sector transport. And those pieces of research have helped to inform this. So we have conducted quite a bit of modelling, and we've ended up with 2 scenarios, one which we're calling GM-led, which is basically leading the way with immediate action. Second looks at a much higher ingress of hydrogen into the grid. That's our second scenario. And then we ran 2 counterfactual scenarios with hydrogen only and electrification only, but I'm just going to focus on 1 and 2 for the remainder of this presentation. And this is what the plans look like once they're complete. This is just for one of our districts, Salford, and it's at a very high level. But from left to right, what it does at the very detailed scale shows us what retrofit's required and what sort of priority we might want to give that retrofit, what the energy networks might look like. So if we're looking at distributed heat networks, where they might be best placed. It looks at where we can potentially place solar PV and looks at electric vehicle charging density, so making the assumption that people with drives might charge at home, but those without drives would need to find an alternative. It starts to look at where we can get potential charging hubs for electric vehicles outside of homes. And then pulling all of that together, it allows us to identify priority areas for demonstration and scale, and importantly, helps us to prioritise those areas so it's almost no regret. Now, although these maps don't look very impressive, the impressive bit is that you can visualize these right down to the street level. So these are GIS based, and you can hone all of this data into a 4-figure postcode level to avoid any GDPR issues. Just taking each one of those in turn, we know that up to about 60% of the 1.4 million homes in Greater Manchester will need some form of insulation retrofit for both the primary and the secondary scenarios. Slightly more in the secondary scenario, and it helps us to try and pinpoint where those priority areas might be. We've mapped out the solar and EV density. We know that local energy generation will be needed if we're going to use more electricity for both electric vehicles and potentially for some of our heat. And we can work out where we've got solar PV options at scale. So this map shows a map of 4,000 sites that we've done on public land, public buildings, and car parks that we can start to move forward under a different program called Go Neutral. And it helps us to work out where our energy generation capacity might come from. As mentioned, we've identified EV charging hubs and the opportunity to bring more charging hubs into play to support the rollout of electric vehicles going forward, and we can do that at the district level. And importantly, in terms of network operators, we've worked closely with Electricity North West and Cadent to look at what the modelling of these future increase in electricity demand might look like, and what the type of transformation might be required to better bolster and cement the grid. And then finally, or almost finally, we've looked at heat priority areas, looking at heat demand and the opportunity to generate heat and distribute it through mini cluster networks. Allows us to start thinking about what proportion of our heat demand can be utilised, can utilise heat networks as a potential opportunity. And then, not forgetting hydrogen, the secondary scenario, we've benefited from the west of the conurbation. There's quite a lot of industrial processes brought together under the HyNet Phase 2 programme, which aims to generate low carbon hydrogen. We don't yet know what the availability of that hydrogen into Greater Manchester is likely to be, but we know it's not likely to happen until the 2030s. We know that hydrogen has a role to play, and we think that, and what we've modelled is that that role, if it's going to be into the gas grid, is more likely to be the west of the conurbation than the east. In addition, though, we do have planning permission going through in Trafford for a 200 megawatt green hydrogen facility, which also could potentially be used for industrial users and heavy haulage. So we tried to mirror what hydrogen impacts might be over the next 5 years. But as I said, this would need to be reviewed in 5 years' time. And with all of that analysis, it allows us to come up with multiple decarbonisation options. And we've just shown the primary and secondary scenarios here. What it helps us to do is think through in particular what our heat demand might be and how we might be able to decarbonise that heat demand. And you can see that in the primary scenario, there's quite a lot of electric heating. In the secondary scenario, as it suggests, it foresees a much higher role for hydrogen. And so there's a swap into hydrogen for the secondary scenario. And the conclusions and insights that we've drawn from this work are, we think that there will be something like £65 billion worth of investment required between now and 2038 to get to this net zero transition. But it's important to note that about 70% of that would be required under business as usual activity. And as I said, what it helps us to do is focus down on near-term activity. So it takes into account national decisions that are going to be made in the future, understands where we're currently at in terms of our uptake of both electric heating and electric vehicles, looks at how we can generate more energy, and starts to set targets for 5-year planning, which is something we haven't had previously. And you can see the targets here, which I think are they are quite strict, but they're probably achievable. The difficulty I think we have is that after the next 5-year period, these figures then rise dramatically. So what we're aiming to do through the local energy plans is to set out at scale some of the demonstration and delivery activity, start to build up the networks in terms of our supply and skills, the training that's required to deliver some of this. And then within the next 5 years or so, really understand how we can move to a much more significant delivery in the second 5-year period. And I think I'll leave it there, Chair. The last slide just gives you an indication of the organisations that have been involved in developing this piece of work.
Thank you very much for that overview, Mark. So just to let everyone know, if you've got any questions, do feel free to put them in the chat as well. Great. So thank you for running us through that, Mark. A quick introduction to myself. I'm Emily Jones, the Head of Stakeholder Engagement at ENA. and for almost 2 years, I've been looking after our outreach and engagement with community energy and local energy plans. And today I'm going to take you through how the networks are preparing for a more locally run system. So as you'll be well aware, there's a lot of focus on national policy at the moment. For example, with the upcoming energy bill and ED2 draft determinations. And something that Mark's really pointed out there is it's really vital to remember plans like Mark's are important in delivering the right action and solutions in the right places. So taking a step back, traditionally our power system has been one way. So, however, new technologies are allowing everyone from big businesses to individuals to challenge this system. The key here really is in redesigning how our grids work in consultation with all stakeholders, including local authorities, so that we can connect more renewable energy projects more quickly. And rolling out new local energy markets that use the latest smart technologies in homes and businesses will allow us to make our grids more capable. A quote that's often used is that the future of energy is as much local as it is national. I'm sure you've heard that all many, many times, but what does this mean to the energy networks? Well, in a sentence, as we do have a packed agenda today, it means that we're taking an active role in supporting the ambitions of community energy groups and local authorities to make those key decisions. Local area plans are driven by local authorities, and your local DNO will be a part of energy planning for your area. And we have Christos and Helen from Electricity Northwest and Caden Gas joining us very shortly to shed more light on the process these networks took to supporting Greater Manchester's energy plans and their own strategies. Britain's networks are always keen to learn by doing, and several of our members are running microgrid or off-grid trials, including SSEN, Northern Power Grid, and SP Energy Networks. And there are a range of research programs and exercises that are supporting community energy projects and exploring these potential new markets. A bit closer to home at ENA, we support the local energy planning process by driving consistency among our member companies. Our Open Networks programme, which some of you may be familiar with, and which is one of our key net zero programmes, is standardising key processes and milestones for customers interacting with the networks to connect projects. Then going back a bit further, in 2019, we grew our original commitment to source flexible solutions before building network reinforcement by releasing our 6 steps for delivering flexibility services, which is available in detail on ENA's website. And as a result of our members' trials and our work to define the market, flexible connections and services are there to help alleviate issues and manage grid constraints. And we're working hard to make faster, cheaper, and more efficient connections. More broadly, the whole energy systems workstream of Open Networks has representatives from local authorities involved in looking at local area energy planning from a gas and an electricity perspective, which is really important for us. And then this can be translated to a local level. And we're also making it easier for everyone to assess the best whole systems solutions that networks can use to upgrade to address constraints through our whole systems cost benefit analysis tool. So our CBA tool for anyone who likes an acronym. More information on this tool and the situations where the model can be used is available on ENA's website. The work that ENA and our members are carrying out is already leading to positive outcomes. For example, this year, our figures show that the UK network operators have tendered around 4 gigawatts of flexibility services, with more still to come. So this puts the UK considerably ahead of every other country in Europe. And we're always looking to bring new ideas into our work, with plenty of opportunities to get involved, which I'm especially leading the work on. So 2 current examples include our annual flexibility services consultation, which has been open for almost 6 weeks now and is closing on Monday. And we can share more information on that in the chat if you haven't seen that already. And our next Community Energy Forum is on Thursday. This is exclusive to community energy groups, and this session will be looking at how we can transition to a smarter and more flexible energy grid. So again, if there's any community energy groups or representatives that haven't signed up to join that, then we can share the information. So we are excited to be joined by a great panel of experts today, bringing their thoughts on the local energy challenge. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to hand over to Dr. Barbara Vest, OBE, to introduce and chair our panel session.
Oh, thank you for that introduction. That was really great. Honestly, and the pair of you have really sort of set up this debate very well, so thank you very much. I'm going to introduce our panelists one by one, and each will give us a brief overview of what they're involved in, and then we will take a Q&A session. I'm really pleased to say that Mark has agreed to stay with us. So Roger Henderson, you've been really good at getting a question in there pretty damn quick. I will not forget you when we come to the Q&A. I will let you ask that question first. Without further ado, I'm going to go over to Christos Kaloudas. I practiced it beforehand as well, you'd never guess. Your DSO Capacity Strategy Lead Manager at Electricity Northwest, and you deal on their local area plan, which we heard Mark discuss. So over to you.
Thanks, Barbara. Good afternoon, all. So if I might share my screen for a couple of slides. I'm Christos Kaloudas, Capacity Strategy Lead with Electricity Northwest. As Barbara mentioned, we are one of the 6 DNOs in the UK, and we supply the northwest of England, including Greater Manchester, Cumbria, Lancashire. I'm not going to talk in detail about our Manchester development plan. There's a lot of material, including annexes and engineering justification papers in our recent submission to the next price control, to RIIO-ED2. You can find it on our website. I'm going to talk in brief around the high-level framework that we apply to take into account stakeholder inputs, including local area energy plans, other decarbonisation plans, to facilitate them. So in other words, to take them into account in the way we plan our networks. So when we talk about stakeholders, we're talking about our customers. We take views directly from commercial projects, industrial projects, and plans, including decarbonisation plans. And we try to understand from that how they are going to affect our electricity demand and generation supplied and connected to our network. A key area is also to understand plans from local authorities and enterprise partnerships. We understand that the local government is expected to coordinate local area energy plans, and this makes their input even more critical. And we expect them to set out the long-term development strategy for their respective area. And we also have the independent distribution network operators that are connected to our networks. So when it comes to local area energy plans, this is a graph that shows that it's not a single direction. We need to be more proactive in our engagement. We are committed to have even more resources needed to support that. So what we do is we try to understand the plans, but we also provide insights. And part of that is also the sharing of more data with local stakeholders so that they can understand more around the ways we plan the network. They can get technical insights, and they can inform us and have a feedback loop of making sure that we understand their plans right. So all that information fits into our distribution future electricity scenarios. As a regulated body, we've been asked by our regulator to have the DFES, our future scenarios, with a main planning purpose, and these are the scenarios that we consider in planning. So it's critical for us to make sure that local area energy plans are part of our DFES. And last slide, just seeing the DFES in the wider network planning landscape. It's part of standardized distribution system operation DSO processes. So It's this bi-directional exchange of data, information, and learnings between our stakeholders and local energy plans and our DFES. And our DFES is our long-term forecast of electricity demand generation, battery storage that feeds into network planning processes. And you can find more information around these planning processes in both the long-term development statements that are published in November and May every year, and also in the network development plans that is a new license condition for all DNOs and is published on May every 2 years. From our side, from Electricity Northwest, we've taken a decision to have a network development plan published every year. So this gives our stakeholders the opportunity to understand what information and what plans we have to facilitate their plans, including the local area energy plans. So this was the very short slide for me, conscious of time. Back to you, Barbara.
Thank you very much. That was absolutely great. So we've heard about the electricity network. We're going to go over and hear about the gas network now. And we'll have Helen Boyle, Head of Regional Development at Cadent Gas, who is responsible for supporting the transition to green gases. And as well as working with potential hydrogen producers to increase hydrogen production, Helen works collaboratively, oh dear, I can't even get my teeth in today, with electricity distribution network operators to help with local authority network zero ambitions. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Good afternoon, everybody. So yes, I'm Helen Boyle, Head of Regional Development for the Northwest and the West Midlands for Cadent. We are the UK's largest gas distribution network operator, so we do the same role as Electricity Northwest for the Northwest, but with gas. So basically we move it around in our pipes, and we're a regulated entity, the same as Electricity Northwest as well. In terms of our network planning and how we're approaching that for the future, clearly natural gas is a fossil fuel, and the imperative is to move away from that. And where we are now is trying to understand the potential role of hydrogen across a number of sectors across all of our network areas. I would say that the Northwest is particularly a front runner when it comes to hydrogen, not just because of the HyNet scheme, but I think HyNet, which has been in evolution for 5 or 6 years or so, is attracting other schemes. Mark alluded to one before in Greater Manchester in Trafford. There's also just been another one that's just been launched in Barrow, Green Hydrogen Production Scheme. So all of those are coming to the Northwest, helping to shape what the future role of hydrogen might be across the range of sectors in that region. In terms of how Cadent looks at that from an infrastructure perspective, it's really important that we look at it with a number of lenses. First of all, a regional basis, because it's very, very different, the conversation around hydrogen, depending on where you are across the country. We work very closely with the DNOs. I think particularly with Electricity Northwest, there's been a close collaboration across a number of years when it comes to network planning with ENW. But all the DNOs across all of our network areas, and of course National Grid Gas Transmission and their role that they have in their project union, which is looking at repurposing their network to take hydrogen. And if you think about a really good analogy when it comes to gas pipes is National Grid are the motorways. We are the A and the B roads that take the gas from the motorways through to your homes. So it's extremely important that we work with all these number of parties to plan what the infrastructure and the changes and the requirements that's needed for the future to decarbonise gas in order to plan our infrastructure across the future. And we do that by having regional schemes. So in the Northwest for us, that's HyNet, and the role that Cadent is playing there is building the first dedicated hydrogen pipeline that will take the hydrogen from where it will be produced at the Stanlow manufacturing complex initially to the local industry that will require it, and then as Mark alluded to earlier on, the future phases will see it spreading out across the rest of the Northwest. But also we have schemes over in the east called East Coast Hydrogen, in our London network called Capital Hydrogen, and we've just launched a feasibility study with National Grid Gas Transmission in the West Midlands called our Hydrogen Valley project, that covers our West Midlands network and a chunk of our East of England patch as well, that takes in the Bacton to over South Wales feeders for National Grid. And that is looking at quantifying the potential demand for hydrogen across a number of sectors, the potential supply, and also identifying any early investable propositions for green hydrogen production in order to meet immediate local demand from industry. So all of those studies are in various stages of progression, but will help to inform what we need to do as a distribution network operator in the future in order to bring hydrogen from where it will be produced to where it will need to be consumed. Try to keep that in a nutshell, Barbara, but obviously happy to take questions further down the line.
Brilliant, and I'm sure there will be lots of questions, don't worry about that. So we've heard from Manchester, a Manchester view, we've heard from an electricity network operator, we've heard from a gas network operator. Now we're going to Hewell Lloyd, who is a research associate at Local Government Leaders Association UK 100. And they help a growing network of UK local authorities seeking to deliver 100% clean energy for the operations and their communities by 2050. That's a big challenge. Over to you, Hewell.
Thank you, Barbara. And I would say for most of that network, it's often before 2050. I think there's a nice sequence because we've considered the electricity networks, we've considered the gas networks. Local government build what you might call a place network and bring that to the party. I've got some slides to share which I will rush through simply because they're mostly images. But I think they're helpful because they're based, I hope you can now see a slide that says locally led. If somebody could say yay.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
So these slides, if I can make it work, are actually based on a presentation I made almost 10 years ago, working with Stoke-on-Trent. And Mark, you may remember some of this. They had ambitions to be energy self-sufficient as a city. So one of their propositions was they had a lot of industrial uses. They had a fair amount of resource and materials that were otherwise waste from other processes. Could they create a circular energy economy? And that little illustration is giving you a sense of a biofueled circular economy, linking the industrial productions to some of the waste processes, to some of the benefits that local community might have. One of the things that local government can bring is a strategic understanding of the place that they look after, that they are representing, that they are in place for. So as part of our work with Stoke-on-Trent, we looked at literally the lie of the land and how the land was being used and might be used, because that has implications for what you might call future energy assets. Turns out that Stoke, for example, produced 3,000 tons of grass cuttings a year. And maybe 10 or 15 years ago, that would have gone into some sort of rubbish process. Clearly, we can all appreciate now that that's essentially fuel for an AD plant. They wanted to take a whole energy, all uses sort of understanding. So we started to quantify both what might be in use in their place now and going forward, but also what might be available to them. And clearly, we've heard from the electricity and the gas networks, but most parts of the UK could benefit from geothermal. Almost every part of the UK could benefit from waste streams and how waste might be processed. And some areas, and depending on where you are, can benefit from waste industrial heat. And Stoke-on-Trent, you'll appreciate, is the home of ceramics production, not just in the UK, but potentially one of the world's bases for that sort of production. An awful lot of heat is exhausted to the atmosphere. So all of these assets coming into play that they could put to use, which led to plans for a local heat network, and that is now being funded as part of a city deal. So there's a whole process of understanding these new assets and these place-based assets, which adds into, and you've seen some of it illustrated in Mark's presentation, what the DNO and the gas network already bring to this equation. So it becomes a tripartite sort of stool. Local government, this was written then about an enterprising council, but that sense of being able to convene, to bring partnerships together, to have a purpose for a place, and importantly, that third one, asset management. We're bringing new assets into play. They're assets that may not be seen by either the electricity or the gas networks, yet they've got both capability and, importantly, for a lot of local authorities, the opportunity to generate wealth for local areas, which you can sum up as some degree of a place taking control of its own destiny. We shouldn't forget that these things used to be local and run and organised by local government. So this was part of our, all local places need to think about their version of 2050, because actually net zero doesn't tell you enough about what you should do in your place for your community. And these were some of the questions we were talking about then, and some of them are still as relevant, yet, as you can see in those questions, many of them need to be worked out in a place, because the assets, the infrastructure, the history of a place, its geography, its life, its land, its building stock, all can affect how you best answer those questions. And then on top of that, because I also work with other things, some of you will appreciate there are increasing numbers of smart assets coming into the energy environment. I think we've probably all understood that electric vehicles will be the majority of vehicles going forward. And many of you will appreciate that an electric vehicle can be bidirectional and becomes a mobile storage device. Well, there will be buildings to grid to come. These are two demonstrators that are in Swansea. So you've got the capability of buildings now becoming not an end user, but an end contributor to how the system might evolve in future. And of course, you can do that at scale, you can do that at site level, campuses, hospitals, all of those sorts of things. And it's important we think about how these things play out. I did a summary for UK 100 in the sense of the expectations that the DNOs were planning for in ED2. And I've just picked out the two figures in red. We're talking about possibly 8 million charge points being fitted to domestic and other premises across the UK by 2028, and as many as 4 million heat pumps. Now, I'm hoping that they will be thought about as combined and integrated assets, because then you can start to take into account this observation about net, not gross. These buildings and buildings like them can manage their interaction with the grid in a way that supports the grid and doesn't just add load at peak times. In fact, it moves the peak. So where do we need to go with some of these things? It really is about having the right framework, and I highlighted one element of a report that UK 100 produced about a year ago, Power Shift. We need this local framework so that we can all understand our role in the process of planning for local energy. And that's both on the existing network side. Some places have heat networks, as we'll all appreciate. How do we bring all these things together in a coherent and fairly consistent way so that we can make the most of the potential benefits? And then very lastly, some potential system outcomes and benefit. That planning and coordination can certainly reduce risk and cost. We're concerned that there's a risk that gas networks will start stakeholder engagement for RIIO-3. In a couple of years' time, the DNOs will do the same, and all the time there'll be local area energy plans happening as well. That's clearly a waste of resource, and we need to find a way of integrating those things to make them part of one process. I think Mark touched on the cyclical nature of local planning. As it happens, the National Infrastructure Assessment that the Infrastructure Commission do is a 5-year cycle. So that might well be the sort of cycle we should start to build in. And you might then say that that should guide the future of RIIO. Bringing those three legs to the stool together gives us a proper sense of all the assets that are both in play and that could be in play. Gives us sight of things literally that are underground. Coal mine water. Many areas of the UK have got massive heat stores in those mines. We can take advantage of that. Over time, that ought to mean local government working with the DNO and the other networks become strategic partners and investment partners. It also might mean, and it varies by perhaps political ambition, there's a greater return on investment of some of these opportunities, because clearly some of those things are very local assets, may well be in local control, be it community or local government or other parties. So you're getting towards a system that's perhaps more coherent, more place-based, and as part of making that work, we would see a role for local government in the future of governance of the DSO, bringing that independent place-based voice, because it's only that voice that will help properly understand the difference between the assets of Suffolk and Southwark, of Staffordshire, and making the most of those as we move forward to achieving that net zero well before 2050, because the sooner some places succeed, the quicker the rest of us can learn. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, that last slide you showed had lots of lines that we could explore as we go through our panel phase. We're coming up to speak to Duncan Law now, who is the Acting Co-Chief Executive, Policy and Advocacy of Community Energy England, and he leads their work to raise the profile of community energy benefits, needs, opportunities and policy obstacles. Over to you.
Thank you, Barbara. Hello, everybody.
Right, you're very quiet.
All right, that means I have to
project.
So community energy is the voice and the connector of the community energy sector. We have 300 plus members doing a huge range of community-led energy projects to address climate change and bring community benefit and social benefit locally. We're all over the country. We do generation, we do demand side stuff, heat, transport, everything. You can see a map of installations on our website, communityenergyengland.org. So the direction of travel is a consensus, I think. The future of energy is local, have said a number of energy ministers over recent years. And the Committee on Climate Change puts another dimension on that, which is to say that if the people of the UK are not engaged in this challenge, the UK will not deliver net zero by 2050. People need to be brought into the decision-making process and derive a sense of ownership of the net zero project. And that's what community energy can do uniquely. Laura Sandys, who many of you will know, put it brilliantly: citizens have a veto on net zero. So unless we do bring them in, they can very easily block brilliant plans. Now, decentralization needs to be designed locally to take account of local conditions and resources and needs and opportunities, and also to deliver local benefit and local wealth. And community energy can bring so many of those things to the table that do not reside in local authorities, do not reside in DNOs. Ofgem, in their recent consultation, mentioned people once and communities not at all. They were mentioned as factors in a market, consumers or customers, but that is, people are so much more than that. Apart from anything else, they are the point of the energy system. Energy is not a good in its own. It's a good when it arrives at people's houses and or businesses, and they use it for stuff. So they have huge amounts of control, and huge amounts of energy decisions and activity happens locally. And we've long argued with the Energy Systems Catapult that community energy should be at the heart of local area energy planning. Obviously, local authorities are fundamentally key. They control the assets, they control the infrastructure, lots of wealth, the planning, they have democratic mandate and so on, but they don't necessarily command trust in the way that community energy is usually able to do. So we held a discussion event with the Energy Systems Catapult, and I have a document that is the output of that, which identifies the benefits of community energy being involved. And that is the ability to convene local stakeholders, many of whom will not be necessarily big energy users or known to the DNO or the local authority. Local knowledge, often going back far further than local authorities have, of need and opportunity and assets, and the ability and the desire to deliver strategic projects, creative design, and an avenue to channel local benefit back to the community, and ownership. As the CCC said, that is fundamental. The ability to promote the projects that arise out of local energy planning and get buy-in for them, get people to agree that this is the desired direction of travel and we should all get stuck in. There are problems with existing rollouts of energy, of local area energy plannings, that it uses Bayes data to a large extent. It produces static projects, static plans, when in fact it should be producing something that is a kind of capability, flexible and changeable, adaptable, maybe even on a more than 5-year cycle to control the progress forward. It is therefore, I would say, better to do community-led energy planning, as pioneered by the Carbon Co-op with Oldham Community Power. Their toolkit, developed with CLARES, the Centre for Local Economic Studies, was launched in June, and you can find it on carbon.coop. And Bureau Happold have been doing amazing work with Energy Systems Catapult in Bury and so on, but also with Community Energy South and Ovesco in Lewis on community heat being a huge challenge, both of buy-in and technically. So then there are other projects like Project Leo. I would urge you to go looking for them. Otley in Leeds, Eynsham attached to in Oxfordshire. The future of energy, the future of everything is local. It's where it's at, and the people and communities have a huge part to play in it happening or not happening, and also in resilience in difficult times coming towards us. So please, if you have a stake in it at all, absolutely involve people and communities and your local community energy group. Thank you.
Well, that was enthusiastic. Thank you very much. Thank you. What a roundup to that introductory panel session. And I've been given 4 questions here just to get you warmed up as a panel interacting together. And Duncan, I think you're going to be quite pleased with the first one, because it's right up your street. It's just what you've been covering there in your presentation. I know we have 1 question in the chat line. So, oh no, we've got 2 now so far. Whilst I do this little warm up, if you'd like to put some questions in there, I will come to you when we get the opportunity. So I think we'll start with, who shall we start with? Mark, we'll go to you. And the first question is to you, what is the biggest benefit of locally led energy plans? I'm sure you've all given us a snippet. Now, Dan was expecting when he gave me these questions that there would be 1 or 2 word responses. I hope you keep them clean.
1 or 2 word responses. To be honest, I think some of the speakers have already touched on this. If we're going to assume that the decarbonisation pathway we follow is going to be more decentralised, it is almost inevitable that the interaction between energy generation, local energy generation, and local energy supply or demand is going to become more complex and more interrelated. So when you start looking at infrastructure development, whether it's new or existing infrastructure, the interrelationship between the energy infrastructure, the transport infrastructure, and the built environment infrastructure will need to be looked at in a much more microscopic level, because there are relationships between supply and demand which can't be ignored. Mm-hmm. And the work we've done suggests that, at least under current pricing mechanisms, although it is changing, some of these low carbon projects struggle to find a return on investment unless you match together supply and demand in a more intricate way than has previously done. So my answer to the question is that there needs to be a more locally defined planning relationship between different infrastructure types, and partly that's to do with technology and partly that's to do with cost, and both of those can be potentially alleviated at the local level.
Yeah, yeah. Christos, how do you see this one?
I would say it's not. It's fair to say there's not a single solution for all. It's every region has different characteristics. I would echo what Mark said here. We need net zero options that can work well at local level and cost efficiently. And there's not one solution for all. We need to it's a top priority to find best solution, no regret solutions, and cost efficient solutions at local level.
And Helen, locally, right down in communities, they might not understand the role for hydrogen. How do you see that sort of developing as we go forward?
I think, and something we've maybe not talked a lot about until the last speaker was people and consumers. At the end of this, there is the largest and thorniest issue is the decarbonisation of heat, because it involves many millions of consumers sat in their homes at the moment. 87% of the UK heats their home by being connected to the gas grid. So a massive challenge that we have is engagement when it comes to consumers and the different choices that they may have. Depending on where they are in the country. So it's really vital that the first step is working out what's possible within a region when it comes to decarbonisation, which is this local planning bit. And then the next step is, well, okay, that's great. How do you engage all the consumers in the area for them to be able to understand the part that they play, the changes that they make, and the options that they have, and what it might cost them? You know, let's be honest, there's a lot of cost involved in infrastructure, but there are costs that will have to be borne by consumers as well. So that's you know, that's a really big challenge. But I agree with everything that's been said in terms of there isn't decarbonisation won't be delivered nationally, it'll be delivered regionally, and that's why it's so important that we think about it in that way. However, it all does have to be stitched together to actually deliver you know, net zero for the UK PLC by 2050. So you can't just kind of do this in isolation in regions. There needs to be that overview that has to be taken to ensure that 2050, if not sooner, is delivered upon.
Yeah. And Hewell, how's your needlework skills then? Can you stitch this together for us? Oh, no, can't hear you.
It's interesting because that challenge of stitching together is emerging from work in Wales on their regional strategies and how that reflects some of the other national as well as very local. I think in a sense, the important thing to remember, it struck me perhaps a few years ago and then reinforced more recently. The nature of this change is not in a sense a preference. Well, one part of it is a preference. I'll come to that. But renewable energy is ubiquitous. And because it's ubiquitous, it could mean that any and every party in any and every place could have access to it. That's quite different to coal, oil and gas. There is more renewable energy than we know what to do with. So the question starts to emerge as who, how, well, what and where comes into play. That's why the system will become less centralised, because the energy is less centralised. The thing I think is reinforcing that is the penetration of EVs. Because of some of the other work I do, you can see people who've got an EV who now know what a kilowatt hour is. They didn't a year ago.
Yeah.
Or 2 years. And because they know that, they're also showing me, and they might be showing you, what their energy profile looks like on their app. It's much better than a smart meter. And then they're also starting to get into, you know what? I mean, Mark talked about, I think it's 2 gigawatts of solar on homes. If you couple that with the right controls and some storage devices, either held at the domestic level or the area level, then people will start powering their own cars in a way the network won't even see. That will not be new load. That will be self-sufficient EV charging. Now, it's not going to be self-sufficient for everyone, and you'll need to think about peaks in the system sense and all of those things. But that really starts to highlight local benefit. I don't think we've got the answer to it yet, but things like REMA will have to think about how it fairly recognises what domestic consumers and users and contributors, because that's what they'll become, how they get a fair deal out of the way the system's changing. And if we get that right, then you will have a lot more assets on the system, as Laura Sandys and others talk about, but you'll then have that buy-in that Duncan and others have talked about. This will be a collective enterprise because people will be able to see it and be part of it. Mm-hmm. So those are the things that really help, in a sense, deliver, but they're also all about local.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for that. Duncan, you told us what you think are the benefits of locally led energy plans, but what have you come across as your biggest blocker to all of this increased ambition?
I think it's, as I said, it's the lack of public engagement and ownership of the net zero project. At the moment, energy is something that's either on or off, and it's related to the click of a switch. It's not actually something that we have any real awareness of the origins or the consequences of. And I think one of the benefits, coming back to the first question of local energy area planning, with any luck, is the re-emphasis on the local as the inevitable direction of the way we do so much. And at the moment, the government's energy and decarbonisation plans are mostly big check, centralised, business-focused industrial supply side. When you get down to the local, you're about balancing a system, because it's much more effective and efficient to do it that way than to haul in large amounts every time you have a little bit of a problem. And if we can then build flexibility and flexibility markets into the way we think about the way we use energy, then we can give people multiple stakes in the energy system, a wallet stake, an app stake, talk about it at dinner stake, you know, I've got solar panels on my roof stake, you know. I think that relocalization is fundamental to everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, so Mark, what are you looking at as your biggest blocker to the increased ambition? My next question is also going to say, what action does government need to take? And I'm assuming that they aren't always so helpful as they could be. I'm being polite. Thinking about Rhys Morgus, our head of BASE.
I think one of the things I'm seeming to spend most of my time on now is finance, and particularly innovative finance mechanisms. So broadly, whilst I accept what other people have said, that there's innovation required, broadly, a lot of the technologies that we need to get us to net zero are already in existence. Sometimes they could be better integrated so that they can come more as a system rather than individual technologies. So, you know, how do you create a smart energy building? And there's a variety of different technologies that are needed to bring that together. But I would say the largest barrier is around finance, and specifically, that's not necessarily capital finance. A lot of it is development finance, to be able to take projects from a good idea to an investment-ready business case. And I think this has been true for quite a long time. And I think why we've seen quite a lot of change in the public sector has been through government funding what they call the Low Carbon Skills Fund, which is really development finance for decarbonisation of buildings. And it's giving local authorities the ability to be able to do some proper planning, some proper feasibility work. Unfortunately, we need that on a much grander scale, not just for the public sector, but for all different asset classes. And we need to find ways that we can utilise innovative finance to invest now and get that return back over a much longer period of time. So we need patient debt, patient equity. But the biggest issue at the moment, I think, is development finance.
Mm-hmm. Christos, are you finding the same?
So, I would echo what Mark says here. I would say that a blocker to increased ambition is also not taking any action here and now. So it's Mark, for example, mentioned in his presentation the numbers required to meet targets and highlighted that it's even higher numbers coming afterwards. I mean, we also understand that, and it's technologies there are no regret options that are cost efficient and businesses can implement here and now. It's better to act now, because if we don't act now, it's this not acting could be a blocker to a longer term meeting of net zero. And it's a fair point to say is that we understand that there is an increasing cost of living, and we need to address that, but tackling that could be also could also include net zero options. So it could be part of the solution to tackle both these crises, and at the same time not lose the trajectory to meet net zero.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Helen, I was a bit concerned during the hustings to hear about fracking maybe being back on the agenda. And there are lots of benefits to hydrogen. I know that there's a scheme within the Gateshead area in Winlayton where they're already running the network with 20% hydrogen in there. Could the government help us more, to expand that scheme, or are there areas doing it and we just don't know about it?
So I think it's right that there's lots going on that people probably don't know about, and what you're talking about is part of the High Deploy programme at Winlayton, the first phase of which was at Keele University campus, looking at providing the evidence around blending up to 20% hydrogen into the gas main. So in other words, mixing hydrogen and methane, which doesn't have an impact on people's appliances in their homes, their boilers, their cookers, their fires, but can have a reduction of carbon emissions by about 6 or 7%. So that was a 10-point plan deliverable. The High Deploy programme was all aimed at providing the evidence for the government to make a decision around the potential role of blending by next year. But there is a part to play that government has around policy certainty over and above what's already been talked about around Treasury, and also there is this massive tension between people's bills at the moment and what needs to happen into the future. Mm-hmm. So we're operating in a really difficult environment, but I think the government understands the challenge, but needs to get on and help around policy certainty.
Yeah, totally agree. And Hewell, the relationship between local authorities and governments, Mark's already highlighted, is difficult. Are they blockers, or is there action there that we can hope to see?
I think, so I spent a year looking at the business plans of the DNOs, the relationships they have with local and combined authorities. You get a reasonable sense that there's an increased interest and practice in the engagement of those parties. I think we would argue that there's a lot more that could be gained from that sort of tripartite relationship between all of the networks in a place and a local authority, because of the things that the local authority can bring, which is both coordination, convening, planning, and a sense of other assets that might be useful. The challenge then, or in a sense, the barrier that makes that less robust or less developed is a sort of unrecognition of the benefits of local, mm-hmm. And of local government in that equation. And whether that's Ofgem not quite supporting it, at some point Ofgem will have to take a view on local area energy planning and what it thinks of it. We would encourage them to take that view sooner rather than later, because then it can be a coordinating, organising framework. Helen talked about the need for some consistency in these things. Well, there's work being done that would start to give us that. And it's not just Ofgem in a sense. I think it's partly why, Duncan, they don't mention people and communities very much. It's all about end users and point of input. There are actually things in between, because we all live in the things in between. So some policy needs to support that opportunity that local offers, and locals both these new assets, different assets, getting the right combination, and the role of the local authority. So there's a challenge there actually as much for DLUC as it is for BEIS, to empower these organisations to do the best they can for their communities. And I think I would argue that as a slightly more philosophical observation, the more actors you've got working on net zero, the more likely you are to learn the best ways to do it and to proceed with greater speed.
Yeah.
If you restrict the actors doing things, then you start to get reliant on them getting it all right. And that's actually quite difficult and unlikely. So let's recognise the benefits local can bring. Let's support it. Let's resource it. Let's encourage that partnership working, because that will also start to support answering some of the other questions like Mark about where's the development finance come from, because you then got three parties in game, not just one or other.
Yeah. Duncan, I'm going to come to you for your thoughts on blockers or what action government needs to do. But when you've given us a few views on that, could you end by telling us what your most exciting project you're currently working on, or what you've delivered, or what's coming has been or will be? And then I'll go quickly around the panel for a quick example from them all. Then I'm going to take the Q&A. So Duncan, over to you. Oh, no.
Thought I'd have learnt by now, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
I agree with both Mark and Huel that that development finance is lacking, and the real intrinsic recognition of the benefit of local. The government has come towards local a lot in recent policy papers, and a lot of the funding for anything to happen is now funneled through local authorities, and that creates a bit of a problem for community energy, because all our support has been withdrawn. There was a brilliant thing called the the Rural Community Energy Fund, which supplied development funding, and in the north west of England was leveraging 70 times more finance for the development funding than the government was putting in, which is astonishing and amazing, and a really good use of government money, rather than just a grant, a capital grant, for which you get £1 a project for every pound you put in. So that kind of government prioritisation would be key. Agree that they need to prioritise support for local area energy projects planning, understand that it will cost, and then pledge to support the projects and the collaborations that arise out of those plans. And my most exciting project is seeing community energy at the heart of local area energy planning, because it is the absolute strategic key to unlocking the future by the fastest route. And alongside that, enabling community energy to do as much as is possible to address the catastrophes that people are facing in the energy crisis. And it's equipped and motivated to do that, and is doing it amazingly.
Excellent, thank you. I'm just going to take the order back through. Christos, Helen, Huel, and then back to Mark, because Mark, the first question in the chat is for you. So Christos, what's your best project, or one you want to brag about?
I would mention one that it's still ongoing, even though my role has pretty much finished on that. It's our load-related investment program for Rio ED2. It's been exciting as we've tried to keep the energy bills low for customers, whilst at the same time try to not foreclose transition to net zero. So I believe we have achieved this with our proposal. We can see that the ex-ante allowance is the lowest per customer across GB in this, and at the same time we've quantified additional network investment required through uncertainty mechanisms in case that a large part of our area is on a trajectory to meet net zero before 2040. So I would say that's by far the most exciting project.
Excellent, thank you. Helen, you've got the bragging rights now.
I think it would have to be our hydrogen village project, which some people on the call are probably sick of hearing me talk about. But this was a 10-point plan
Christos
deliverable.
nodding, yes.
Chris doesn't know about it. Mark knows about it. And this is all aimed at providing the evidence for government to make or help to make its decision around the role of hydrogen for heating. And it's a village in a part of Ellesmere Port that, if we get the go ahead, will run on 100% hydrogen for 2 years, starting in 2025. So it's been an enormous amount of work so far, but very interesting and exciting.
Excellent. Well, you've got a problem. Which local authority are you going to shine the spotlight on?
I'm going to go for the future, because both of those observations made me think about two exciting projects I'd like to see. So the first one is sort of Buffy FES, and you're going, what's he talking about? Well, we all know what FES is, future energy scenarios. BU is for bottom up. So National Grid is starting to regionalise its FES and understand that. I suspect between Mark, colleagues at Electricity Northwest and Cadent, you could start doing a bottom-up one, which would be much better, because that's what your local planning is doing. And we'll get to a point where FES won't be so out of date, to be honest, because it will be properly informed by what people see is working. So that was one. So Buffy FES. And then the second one, actually responding to Helen's point, I'd really like to see, because one of the reasons UK 100 got involved in this whole area of sort of policy and decision making is we were concerned that too many places that would never get hydrogen were waiting for it. And in doing that, they were going to miss what they should be doing, which is something else. And I think, Helen, the hydrogen village is a good example of, we can do it in some places. Let's do that more quickly. Why are we waiting till 2026 to have a decision on some of that? But equally, if it's a place that already isn't on the gas grid or isn't going to get a standalone rural hydrogen network, can we just let those people know so they can work out their own? Now, energy planning locally will start to do that, because it is. But we are concerned that there's still not enough sort of foresight coming out of BEIS, Ofgem or others that would say, if you live this close to something that's potential hydrogen source and hydrogen distribution network, then you've got a reasonable hope or a reasonable prospect it's worth waiting for. If you're over here, don't think about that. There are other solutions. There's then still a fuzzy middle, and I don't know how wide the fuzzy middle sort of ring of the onion might be. But again, at least people would know where they are, and they can make some strategic choices about that. So part of my sort of exciting other project would be an electric village to help sort out these people over here who will never get a hydrogen village, because we'll need to work out both.
Yeah, thank you. Mark, over to you finally.
So I'll try and answer the question in the chat as well, but I think actually I agree with most of what the speakers have said. I'd like to address this bit around bottom up. So I think the local energy plans that I've presented today have an element of bottom up in them. So you'll notice that Carbon Co-op were one of the consultees. And I don't think these things are mutually exclusive. They are different levels, and not all communities will have the wherewithal to be able to do very detailed planning. So you need to have something above that, but wherever you can, you should engage with the local population. That's what we've tried to do. So those two things aren't mutually exclusive. I think one of the projects I'm perhaps most proud of at the moment is the Go Neutral programme that I mentioned in the presentation. And what that's trying to do is look at installing more local energy on local authority land and buildings. And there's a whole raft of reasons for that, but not least because of leadership, is to show that if we can make it work and stack up financially, then there's no reason that others couldn't do the same thing. Yeah. And I think that will be important no matter what we do on energy efficiency, or indeed whatever sort of heating system we use. And then I'll try and finally answer the question that I think you wanted me to have a look at in the chat, which was around the different scenarios. What we've basically said is that we understand and fundamentally agree that hydrogen is going to have a role. And we've mapped out two different scenarios that show how, if hydrogen ingress into the gas grid, government makes the decision on that in 2026, we know the way that's going to play. And Greater Manchester is one of those areas that could potentially take hydrogen into the gas grid. But we don't want to have to sit on our hands until 2026 or later. So the primary scenario we've used is to move forward over the next 5 years, looking at how Potentially for heat, we've got heat networks and electric with perhaps a small ingress of hydrogen in some areas. That's just for the next 5 years while we wait for the government decision. But at the same time, we are supporting the development of local hydrogen production for industry and transport. And that's how we've managed to balance those two scenarios. In 5 years' time, we'll have a better understanding of what national government policy is going to look like, and we can reforecast and replay our scenarios based on that decision.
Hewell?
I think what Mark's describing is in a sense exactly how this is going to evolve. And I'm slightly picking up on Lewis's question about postcode lottery.
Thank you.
We're not starting from the same playing field initially to recognise both the different nature of places, but also Mark's working for a combined authority with a mayor. All the mayors have a convening power that other local authority leaders don't quite have. There may be more mayors. I think I saw last week Derbyshire, Nottinghamshire combined thing. I think there's something that may happen in Cornwall. So there will be a challenge about the relative balance of ambition and the drive behind that ambition. Yet the other thing that must be happening, even if you don't have a mayor, is as places do local planning for energy, and Wales has committed as a government to do all of Wales by 2024, you'll just get a better understanding of some of these trade-offs. And then where people can see no regrets opportunities, as Mark's describing, they can move on. Anything that BEIS and perhaps to some extent Welsh and Scottish governments could do that help give some of that clarity, the sooner investment decisions can be made, because you're de-risking some of those things. So absolutely don't see why we should be waiting for 2026 on some of these answers. And great to see, and I know you've been doing this for years, Mark, but you and I know of other authorities who are essentially trying to do the working out anyway, because I think what we'll find is the evidence you gather will then help BEIS make a national decision. And I just hope they make a national decision that recognises Manchester is not the same as Grimsby, or not the same as Humber, and not the same as, I don't know, Brent. But opportunities, but it will always be, perhaps, Lewis, going back to your question, a degree of a postcode lottery, and some of that is actually to do with devolution, not to do with energy at all.
Right, interesting, thank you. Christos, you wanted to make a point too.
Thanks, Barbara. I wanted to make a point on bottom-up mentioned earlier. So it's really important if we want to have let's say best planning decisions for local energy plans, for the electricity network, for the gas network, we need to actually merge bottom-up approaches. So from our end, we have a bottom-up DFES, and we would really welcome a bottom-up local area energy planning inputs and interactions to understand through a bottom-up. And on the point around FES, I would like to say that that's an ongoing process. It was a challenge raised by all DNOs to grid until now that they need to include information from DFES. It needs to be factored in, because the DNOs have this direct interaction with stakeholders when they stand the connection pipeline for all technologies. It's more around an understanding of what's happening on the ground at every location. We've seen progress. So we've seen, for example, the ESO capturing the embedded capacity register. We've seen them noting in the latest regional phase that they want to work with us to include more information around the demand side of things. So it's ongoing process. It's challenging to merge and standardize things. We've been working in open networks through ENA the last 4 years to standardize processes, and it's ongoing process, but I'm optimistic that we are getting there.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to thank Connor and Hewell for sharing some links in there. I've got a question I wondered about. So you're telling us today about some fantastic projects that you're involved in, the ones that you like the best, but does the public really understand what's going on and why we're doing it? And I know that you're all collaborating with each other. Hopefully you're sharing learnings. So, you know, if you're finding something works in one area, there's that many choices available. And as someone alluded to today, I think this year will not one size fits all. So what do we need about to get the story out to the public. I mean, for local authorities, do you have buildings that you're working on, you're regenerating or whatever, to become an exemplar that the public could come into, like, for example, a town hall or a library? What community projects have you got, Duncan, that you're really proud to show off to people and explain? Do you want to have a go first, Duncan?
Yes, God, where do I start? There are community projects all over the country. The thing about exemplar buildings is that very often it produces an end result that is unattainable for the people on the ground. So it's not necessarily inspiring or motivating. What we think you have to do is to start where people are. And very often they're in intransigence and couldn't care lessness. So it's actually something that captures the imagination, or somebody putting solar panels on the house next door and then talking about it, and then it's the business of normalizing it and making it part of everyday currency. And in the energy crisis, we have a huge opportunity, and that is that we live in the leakiest houses, and leaks are not that difficult to stop up.
Yeah.
And if you have the skill to do that and can spread that through your immediate local community, I would say you're almost duty bound to do it. And that is kind of the attitude that community energy is taking. So the most important thing to engage people in change is being practically involved in something, in that change. And if that change is a local project that is visible, that actually will help speed up the change in the zeitgeist, that is beneficial, that brings benefit to you as a participant, but also to your wider community, then people will be more involved in the transition, and the wind will be on the right side of the sail to speed it up. So that was a quite general response, but our community energy's low-tech sort of draft busting emergency responses to the energy crisis are incredibly exciting, incredibly powerful, because once you've helped somebody survive this winter, they're going to be much more receptive if you start talking to them about heat pumps.
Mm-hmm. Mark, have you got any public buildings that you've converted?
So, I mean, across the country, there are public buildings that could be held up as exemplars. So I think that's not necessarily the issue. The issue, I think, is that, well, I'll make 2 points.
Mm-hmm.
The most recent round of funding for public sector decarbonisation comes with it some fairly stringent criteria, which wouldn't allow you to take a building to become an exemplar. It makes you focus on heat and heat decarbonisation almost solely. Right. So you'd need to put more investment in if you're going to create an exemplar building. And I would say most of the exemplars around the country are more likely to be new build than they are retrofit of existing. That would just be my surmise. There will be some. I do agree with what's already been said around taking people with us. And I think if you engage people, then that's one way to do it. My slight pushback on that is that it's actually quite difficult to engage people on this agenda more than a superfluous level. So if you look at recent polls, 80% of people in the UK and across Europe are concerned about climate change. But when you ask them what they could do and whether they're aware of what they can do, that awareness drops down quite substantially. Right. And even those people who think they're aware don't always get the answer right. Yeah, so they worry much more around food, for example, which is important, but in terms of direct emissions isn't at the top. So I have a different proposition, and some of this is sadly already being enacted by the energy crisis that we're currently going through. Mm-hmm. But I think to get to the majority of people, not just those people who are environmentally minded and actually listening, but to get to the majority of people, we need to create system change. And that means we need to make the things that we want to see happen, we need to make them either cheaper or simpler or sexier. And if we do that, then people will change. They don't need to worry about convincing them about carbon and saving the planet. They'll do it for other reasons. So that's my challenge. It's about creating system change, which encourages people to see the beneficial types of transition that we would like to see enacted as being simple, cheap, sexy, one or preferably all of those three. And then we'll see rapid change at the sort of scale and the sort of speed that we need.
So we're going to measure it by the 3 S's: simple, speed, sexy. Okay, that is a catchphrase. Can anyone run with that one? Is the ENA going to do that? I wonder. You will.
It does prompt one observation. I don't think we can move all the population at once. I don't think that's how these things work anyway. EVs, as I sort of alluded earlier, they're going to drive some of it because they're an accessible way for people to understand their energy use, which will then open up other energy conversations.
Yeah.
The thing that has emerged from a few conversations around the DNO local authority relationship, though, some of us are old enough to remember there used to be retail electricity board shops.
Yes.
As a place where you could go and mostly buy kit, I remember, but I'm not old enough to remember what you could buy. I wouldn't be surprised if in a few years' time we have some of those return, because it's in the DNO and the network's interests to help people install the right stuff. You know, in other roles I've done, we've long argued that the DNO should have done smart meters because then they would have a low voltage monitoring system already. You know, there's all sorts of things that would have helped. But that retail space, which maybe brings together, Mark, you talked earlier about technology integrations. You know, if you're, whichever home you're going to end up in, if you're in the Ellesmere Port hydrogen village, there's a process, I think, Helen, that you'll have to go through with all the residents to engage them in what that might mean, what it might mean for their existing equipment, to give some people opt-outs if they have a aversion to hydrogen in their home. We can't do that everywhere. So we need to learn what that's telling us and then make these things accessible so people can, in a sense, buy into and buy the things that will work for them. And the only caveat, I think, to that is, to some extent, what we've been talking about. There will be parts of the UK where you really shouldn't be allowed to buy a hydrogen boiler because your bit of the gas network isn't going to be there in 5 years' time. And then there'll be other places, to take your Ellesmere Port village, where you might discourage people from fitting heat pumps because it will dissipate all the hydrogen load. Mm-hmm. So how can we help people understand the place they live in and what its energy future might look like is probably going to be one of the things of the next 5 or so years. And local government, I would have thought, as a trusted independent voice that's not of the energy system, would be quite helpful in helping get that message across to people.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, that's absolutely wonderful. Honestly, thank you ever so much for participating today. It's been really tremendous. I have a couple of wrap-up comments to make about future events. Thank you to the ENA for putting this programme together, particularly Dan and Josh and Emily for speaking today. That was really, really helpful. Our series has an event coming up in October, which is focusing on energy system resilience, and it'll detail measures that our industry has in place regarding energy resilience and cyber security. So that'll be interesting going into the winter. I wish you all the very best. Panelists, participants, thank you very much for coming along today. Your attendance has been much, much appreciated. And have a safe time, everyone. And let's hope things take a turn for the better. Okay. Bye now. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Barbara. Bye, all.
Thank you.